Thank you, Alan. Okay, thank you for doing that too. Thank you for coming. My name is Wakkary, and this is Audrey Desjardins, and we are from Simon Fraser University and also Eindhoven University of Technology. And today we're going to be talking about tutorial authorship and the potential role for interaction designers as hybrid designers. This is a study about sort of us attempting to do DIY tutorials, and we are going to actually talk about the details of that, but we really also wanted to raise approach the issue from a somewhat deeper perspective, and that is the idea of tutorial authorship. So in relation to DIY practices, we really can consider tutorial authorships as critical. That is the idea of authoring tutorials. That without it, we tend to focus on the building and everything else, but you can imagine without the tutorials, there wouldn't really be much in the way of DIY as we understand it today. So our paper and this presentation is really organized around two questions. So what's the quality, that is how good is a typical DIY tutorial? And then what role can interaction designers play in supporting and enhancing the quality of tutorials in the practices of DIY? But we did take I guess, somewhat of a particular approach. That is a combination, I guess, of an empirical and analytical approach. That in the middle, we have an autoethnographic study in which we take on the role of DIY enthusiasts, and we attempt to build based on 10 tutorials. But we really frame this whole discussion and the analysis around the idea of tutorial authorship and tutorial practices, and we begin that argument by looking at early DIY practices, there's print DIY in the main, and then we kind of look back at the role of interaction designers, or we look at the role of interaction designers in relation to this idea of tutorial authorship. So let me begin with print DIY tutorials and tutorial practices. So some of you may know this, and for those of you who don't, this is the Whole Earth Catalog. This really came out of sort of emerged in the late 60s, really of the countercultural movement. Bay Area was founded by Stuart Brand, and really saw it as a way to kind of somewhat of an activist, or a way to mobilize approaches that were related to self-sustainability, at the time what referred to as ecology, and do-it-yourself. And the catalog was not really a catalog of DIY tutorials, but it really was a catalog of references and resources that would really help people be either much more ecologically or environmentally aware, and really put that into practice in terms of the ways in which they could do it themselves. And so it was a democratizing of practice, a democratizing of making. Another interesting example with completely different contexts, which is cooking cookbooks. So this is The Joy of Cooking. The author is Erika Raumbauer. It's probably the most famous cookbook, the most purchased, probably the most read. It really, sort of at the early 20th century, really with the modernization of the kitchen and the family home, this was her idea of the sort of evolution of the cookbooks, and really with the notion of trying to bring French cooking into the American household. And so really paid attention to really making it rather simple and clear, and developing and taking on the responsibility to develop the competences around the home, for the home chef. So for those of you who want to know how to skin a rabbit, here it is. But also really sourced the materials based on what was then really growing of the grocery stores that were, of course, spreading throughout North America at the time, but really paid attention to not only the idea of how to cook a particular recipe, but really, as I said again, the whole notion of developing the home chef. A third example that we look at is what's known as the Electron. This was originally invented or put together by Georg Gregor, and it was an electronic toolkit, and was really with the hopes of teaching people about electronics. It was actually purchased later by Braun at the urging of Dieter Rams, and Dieter really saw in it a really powerful learning tool, and a way to sort of bring the notion of electronics and the power of electronics and the ability to build electronics to the masses, so to speak. But what Dieter Rams had done was he took the toolkit and he reshaped it, he redesigned it. He redesigned the kit itself, so the various components and the various parts that are put together, the manual, the packaging, the whole thing, in terms of making it a much more accessible learning platform. And in fact, Massimo Banzi, who later on went on to put together Arduino, was really inspired by the electron as a child. So this is our, we really wanted to look at this early print DIY and try to establish an understanding of tutorial practices before we discuss the actual study we did, which I'm going to ask Audrey to present, which is our autoethnographic study on trying to do DIY tutorials.
Thank you, Ron. So this autoethnographic study really had for aim to try to answer this question of what is the quality of a typical DIY tutorial, and by this we really mean how good it is or how effective it is at transferring information to make a DIY project. So to do this, 6 researchers from our design studio played the role of DIY enthusiasts and tried to complete 10 DIY tutorials. So playing that role wasn't very hard for us because most of us are already DIY enthusiasts. We had a really broad range of different quality of skills, so from technical and electronics to more craft and even home improvement. And we also have to say that we had access to all the tools that we need to complete those tutorials, going from really simple hand tools to a laser cutter, for example. So we selected 10 different projects from commonly used tutorial sources. So, for example, Thingiverse, Instructables, Make Magazine. We also used some projects that were presented on different design blogs that were widely spread. And so those projects were placed. We selected them and on this range from easy to hard projects to accomplish, mostly on the technical aspect. And so this, for example, went from a simple cardboard DIY lamp to a DIY cell phone base, or built from the ground up from electronic components. So for each of those projects, we had at least 2 researchers building them. And so we documented the builds with those time-lapse videos that you see here, with a photo every 5 seconds. We also, in addition to those photos, took photos of the different steps, the different components, and what we were actually doing. And then finally, we also annotated the tutorials themselves with what was working well, where we were confused, what were challenges that we were seeing. So in all of those projects we found, or in all of the tutorials we found challenges, but some of those tutorials were actually so challenging that we were not able to complete 2 of the projects that we had set up for. So once we had all the data collected, we started to do our analysis, and so from that we came up with 3 different categories to answer a question of what is the quality of a DIY tutorial. So we won't have time to go into detail with those categories, but I'll give you a quick overview. So the first one was competences, components, and tools. So really we were looking at the necessary skills, knowledge, and resources to build those projects. Secondly, we also looked at the sequencing, or the order of the tasks that are required to accomplish the project, hopefully presented in a chronological way. And then finally, we also looked at communication, so the good and bad use of text, and also how images and videos would support that text or sometimes hinder also the understanding of that. So in addition to those 3 categories, we also found that accuracy was actually an orthogonal concern to all those categories. So information might be well communicated, but if it's not accurate or if it's not correct, then it's not good at all. So I won't go into detail for those 3 categories, but I'll touch on the first one, which was components, competences, and tools. And so what we found very interesting is that those 3 aspects are very interrelated. So for example, a tutorial that requires soldering also requires, requires the knowledge and the access to the tools, the materials, and also the know-how of the action of soldering. In our tutorials, we also saw different things about those 3 aspects. So minor errors in tools, materials, and abilities became major hurdles over time if they were not resolved in the beginning of the tutorial. We also saw that components, competences, and tools were difficult to determine or prepare for ahead of time. So it's hard to look at a tutorial at first glance and figure out what are the competences that I'm really going to need to actually do that project. And then finally, it was also hard to anticipate the levels of expertise across the range of know-how from crafting to electronics. So often those projects were not only looking at one specific type of know-how, but many, and combining them. So from our analysis, we came up, we saw a list of really practical recommendations for how to make the quality of DIY tutorials better. So I'm just going to go over them now to give you an idea of what we think should be changed to make those tutorials better. So the first one is to firstly ensure that information is accurate. Then do not omit necessary tools and components. And when presenting those necessary tools and components, clearly identify them. Fourthly, identify prerequisite and necessary components. We also propose to clearly sequence tasks and required information, and to divide those tasks in manageable steps. So sometimes we saw that steps were too long or too short, and it was hard to follow. And then finally, to communicate through texts and images in a proximity to each other and relevant tasks, and then to provide quality images with consistent orientation, specifically for those projects that are very spatial. So this is the first contribution of our paper, really those practical recommendations for DIY tutorials. But I'm going to hand it over to Ron to discuss more the role of the hybrid designer.
So as I said at the outset of the paper, that we really did want to look at this sort of beyond the specifics of a given tutorial, and just felt we did have to give the fairly practical recommendations as we did come across these in our analysis. But really I want to turn to the notion, return to the idea of tutorial authorship that we discussed in Print DOI, and really begin to see how this might help us with our second question, which was to remind you, what role can interaction designers play in supporting and enhancing the quality tutorials and the practices of DIY? So, sort of looking at our own sort of travails and challenges in doing the tutorials, reflecting back on what we learned from the Print DIY, we really put together what we saw as a set of commitments really that might begin to shape or articulate the notion of tutorial practice. And so as one of those commitments would be authorial promise. So this really speaks to the idea of the accuracy and the credibility, that if somebody stands up to be a tutorial author and claims that authorship, that there are certain promises that come with that. And that was very clear. It was part of the ethos of the Whole Earth Catalog. That was very much what that was about. It was about a vetting a very particular set of resources with particular sets of values and commitments with a particular aim in mind. The second commitment, if you like, is the awareness of the audience. And not only how to do a particular thing, as I showed in the Joy of Cooking book, but really take on the responsibility to develop the competences within the audience. So that was the goal within the Joy of Cooking, was to develop the home chef. And lastly, and we revert back to the example of the electron, which is really what Dieter Röhm had done, which is really shaping and guiding the interaction of the resource itself. So we think about tutorial practices as we described them, and then put them together with what we think are some of the values of interaction design practice. So there clearly is, for interaction designers, the understanding of technology as a medium. And so the skills and knowledge of how to shape that. And I think that's clear in some of our better approaches to HCI and learning and educational technologies. It almost goes without saying that within HCI and interaction design, we have a strong analytical focus on users. So we really keep the notion of audience in mind. And we have a trained ability to co-design and mediate expertise. And this is really what we're suggesting in the role of hybrid designers. So to draw on some of the things, at least the commitments or the notions behind participatory design. So our response to our question really is that the practice of tutorial authorship and interaction design can be brought together in a hybrid designer. So what do we mean by a hybrid designer? Well, we've already seen one, and that was a really great antecedent, which was Dieter Röhm's approach to the electron. And so again, really playing that role of shaping the resource. A more contemporary example is by Antonio Scarponi, and this was really in response to the notion of a hydroponic kitchen, which was fairly complex, and Phillips had actually envisioned one, and it involved quite a bit of technology, put together a tutorial in which you could simply use IKEA parts and local resources from a pet supply store, and really put it together as a package and a well-reasoned tutorial to really enable people to put together their own hydroponic kitchen. So it goes beyond the idea of just designers designing tutorials, but really stepping back from our current understanding, if we reflect back on what we believe we do as interaction designers, and in this case, we focus on the design of resources for further action. So a tutorial is a great example of that. So we focus on these resources rather than finished systems or artifacts. That the notion is that we shape the content, the form, and the reception in a way that actually supports other practitioners. So to support the practice of and help develop and enhance tutorial authorship. So with that, I just want to conclude and just go through a summary of what we did. We put at the middle of our study this autoethnographic approach to looking at the building of 10 DIY tutorials. We framed this discussion with a look at analysis of early print DIY to get an understanding of tutorial practices. From there, we had some fairly practical recommendations, but we really asked the deeper question around how this might reflect back on interaction design practices and suggest the role of hybrid designers as a way to kind of work together with other experts and other practitioners in developing and further refining the notion of tutorial authorship. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Paul Durish from UC Irvine. Thank you. I really enjoyed this. I was really struck by your invocation of the joy of cooking and sort of pointing to cookbooks as sort of early instructable. And it was reminding me of work, there's work Arjuna Pajarai has done on like the history of cookbooks, especially in India, and the notion of the crafting of a certain kind of ethnic identity through cuisine in those. And it made me wonder whether we might want to think about instructables and tutorials in the sort of DIY space as also attempting to actually convey a set of sort of cultural values about what it means to be a designer or a hacker or a DIY person, and whether that affects the kinds of things you're telling us. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think it is, we actually do comment on this in the paper. We didn't, I think there were all kinds of issues. I think it's a mistake to take DIY as a globalizing practice, and there were all kinds of issues, the very practical ones to sourcing, but we certainly the notion of what might be various cultural processes really get embodied or manifesting, as you said, cooking and cookbooks, and there are very differences there. So I think this is something that I think is, and I think actually some work that has been done in this area, and you and some of your colleagues, but I think this is something that we definitely do want to think about, and I think a cookbook and actually trying to understand the way in which it went through the material culture to get where it was doing and designed it in shape to do what it was trying to do is a great example. And I think it's something we could learn from for sure. Thanks. Okay.
Hi, Jared Nibb, University of Bristol. There's an interesting kind of ongoing tension between kind of DIY and maker tasks and kind of what the specificity of each of those things is. And I wonder whether some of the things you're looking at are kind of calling for a formalization which always favors the end product, but doesn't necessarily look to the challenge of actually doing the task, and whether actually when you take on something like an instructable, actually part of the joy is in the challenge of actually interpreting what the person has tried to write down, as opposed to what they've actually written down. And I was wondering whether you just cared to comment on that.
So I think if I understand you correctly, I think we did try to address that with the notion of developing competences. And I think that there were a set of issues that configure around the tutorial itself. And I think that that's clearly something that is, I think within the tutorials, I think part of our approach to this, by putting it within a larger context of tutorial authorship, was actually to raise some of those issues, just to look at, you can go from the tutorial to the very specific, as you said, the set of tasks, but you can move from there, and there are a whole set of other issues that this raises. And rather than go and try to address, we tend to operate on a level of scale which actually doesn't allow us to kind of address the other issues that you're talking about. But for certain, I think that we have to, I mean, as in the context, let's say, being a social practice, that if we don't attend to the competences and the development of those people involved in that practice, then the practice will wither and go away.
All right, cool. Thanks.
Super quick. Okay.